Thank y'all so much for joining us. I'm Trevor Williams with Global Atlanta, and I have been privileged today to be kind of leading some of these sessions and leading us along as we go through the conference. And I really appreciated the previous discussions and all the research that's being done among the partner institutions. Again, Global Atlanta is a news website here in Atlanta and covers Atlanta's connections with the world. So the theme of this conference is very dear to our hearts. And we have a book today that really represents this theme. And the declaration that ATL is global, I don't think was always a declaration. You might have put a question mark on the end of it in the 1980s and 90s. But I think that declaration being made now has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about today. So we've got Mike Dobbins here. Mike is a professor of practice. Let's see if I get this right. Make sure I get this right. In the School of City and Regional Planning at Georgia Tech's College of Design. And Mike is also the author of Atlanta's Olympic Resurgence, How the 1996 Games Revived a Struggling City. Yes, he's got the book there. You can buy it on all the platforms, and I've got the Kindle version. But hopefully, I'm going to get my hands on a paperback or hardback copy too. So, Mike, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be here. Hi, everybody. Looking forward to this conversation.
For sure. And just a quick note about Authors Amplified. This is a series of interviews that we do in partnership with the Atlanta Global Studies Center. We've had 12, I guess 13 so far. We started them during the pandemic, and the idea was to elevate expert voices in international affairs, global business, Atlanta's connectivity with the world, to showcase the expertise that we have here in our backyard as these projects that we just saw have done. And, as a publication, we're often tasked with going out and finding resources, sources to quote in our articles. And we like to contact people here in our backyard instead of going out to, the quote unquote experts in other parts of the country. So Mike is one of those authors, and we thank you so much for being here. The book was published in 2021, 25 years after the city of Atlanta had this unlikely, I think by all accounts, victory getting the Olympics to come to Atlanta in such a seminal moment for the metro area's internationalization. You frame the Olympics as reviving the city. And you have Resurgence, which I guess plays upon the resurgence kind of sentiment that Atlanta has adopted with the phoenix rising from the ashes. Why did you frame it that way? As I've written about this, I think the tendency is to think it has been a steady continuum of Atlanta's growth and internationalization. But it sounds to me like there was a time that you saw that the city was in the doldrums, and then the Olympics kick-started it.
Well, I think the principal reflection that we had when we set about writing this book was that Atlanta had been dropping in population from the 60s to 1990. It dropped from 500,000 people to 400,000 people. And the whole trajectory of how principally Andy Young and others were able to dream this thing about having Atlanta to be the host city for the 1996 Olympics was actually a moment in time. And like you say, Atlanta's moments in time, the Cotton States Exposition 100 years earlier was one where the sort of Atlanta booster community felt like, well, we're different from Birmingham, we're different from Memphis, we're different from these other cities. And I think what has driven the city's sort of less than, let's say, less awful response to the ravages of post-Reconstruction and Jim Crow and all of that, I think was, we've had moments of really nadir moments, for example. Cotton States, the race riots in 1907, the lynching of Leo Frank in 1913, were all nadir-type moments. And somehow the spirit of boosterism seems to be a real definer of how Atlanta tries to position itself, did in the Cotton States Institution and did again in the run-up to the getting the Olympics.
Well, I think the Cotton States exhibition is really interesting to mention. I don't know how much you get into it in the book, but this was 100 years before the Olympics, right, 1895. And that was also around the same time that the modern Olympic movement was born, right, 1896. And then we had, obviously, the Centennial Olympics here in Atlanta. But what was that Cotton States exhibition here in Atlanta? I'm not sure everybody really knows that much about it. And frame it in the context of what was going on post-Reconstruction at the time.
I actually don't know a whole lot about it myself, except that it was an exposition. It's sort of like a World's Fair on a smaller scale to try to announce that Atlanta was ready to move beyond the Civil War and so on. Mm-hmm. And it actually was more in the context of 100 years earlier, more in the context of recognizing that women have rights and that blacks have rights. And there was a muted theme even then on that point.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Booker T. Washington gave his famous Atlanta Compromise speech at that conference at Piedmont Park. And, so in my limited understanding, it seems like it was a statement of progress for the city that then had a very strong backlash in the years to come, as you mentioned, with the race riots, et cetera. But I thought it was important to put that in perspective because Atlanta is, this boosterism you talk about is not a recent thing, right? And it's been, like you said, a thread that's run through the city's positioning in the world. So can you talk about the impulse for the Olympics and the idea, like where that came from? I read in the book that part of it was a result of this kind of intercity Southern competition. That somebody heard there was that Nashville was mulling a bid, and Atlanta thought it needed to put itself in the ring.
Well, that run-up came before I got here. I got here in 1996 in June, which was when things were really getting hot, and Billy Payne, I think a lot of you would know his names. He was an attorney in Atlanta, and he had this idea, and he got Central Atlanta Progress people involved in it, and most importantly, he got Andy Young involved in it. Andy Young was just coming toward, or had actually left his mayoralty. He spent 8 years as mayor after being Jimmy Carter's ambassador to the UN earlier. And so he was a sort of principal element in pulling together a group of about 12 guys. I think at that point they were all white except for Andy, and I think they were all male except for Shirley Franklin, who joined that group as part of the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games. And they put this thing together, and there's a whole story about how that happened. My co-author, Leon Eplin, who regrettably has since deceased, was right in the middle of all that because he was Maynard Jackson's commissioner of planning before Andy Young was elected mayor. And then the first thing that when Maynard got the idea that, hey, these things might really happen, then he got Leon back to do an Olympic development program reflecting the city's perspective and the city's needs, which was critical. Maynard was committed, and his successor and my boss, Bill Campbell, were committed to using these games in a way that benefited the people of the city of Atlanta, which had not really been in the foreground of the original Atlanta Committee for Olympic Games group.
Tell us a bit about some of those priorities. You were tasked with kind of carrying those out.
Yeah,
the sort of legacy after the fact in a lot of ways.
I think both Maynard and Bill Campbell almost took the view, if we're going to do this thing, we got to figure out how it's going to benefit our people. And actually, one of the things that you might reflect on later is what were some of the lessons that came out of the Atlanta experience, and that was actually one of them, because the most Olympics before and after have been strongly funded by central government, like China or Australia or Greece or Spain. And this was not. The U.S.'s experience with Olympic work is that basically the federal government doesn't become a co-sponsor. And that's been true all the way along. So from that point of view, the idea of government coming to the fore to prioritize and strengthen and come up with funding strategies and funding techniques that would actually improve the conditions of the city was a really important step. And actually, I've got too many stories to tell about this, but that doesn't mean that we solve the problems. And our job, Leon Epplin, co-author, Randy Rourke, who's now retired, living in Florida, but he basically worked for Clara Haley Axum, who was the person who ran the city's venture, which is called Corporation for Olympic Development Atlanta. She was the director. Randy was her director of development and planning, and got an enormous amount of stuff done in a pretty short time. I mean, we didn't have much time. My job when I got to the City Hall was to figure out how to seek ways to bridge the gap between the clear and pretty well expressed elitism and of the white side of the agenda, and look for the development needs for people in the city and figure out a way where we could work together, basically, and come up with responses to the Olympic Development Program that Leon Epplin put together for Andy Young, and then to actually implement it, which led to the adoption of a couple of bond issues that supported meeting some of the, talking about some very simple stuff, talking about some bigger stuff like planning, because CODA, Corporation for Olympic Development Atlanta, did detailed neighborhood development plans for the 6 neighborhoods immediately around what we call the inner ring of Olympic activities. And that sort of we brought in other resources, empowerment zone resources, and so on, and we cobbled together enough money to do, I don't know how many, probably very few of you actually remember Peachtree Street, which was cracked sidewalks and no trees, and none of that kind of stuff had occurred. And so putting together our side of the program, looking at Mechanicsville and Summerhill and Peoplestown and Old Fourth Ward and Butler, Auburn, those neighborhoods, Vine City, was to, well, at least let's get some lights on the street, let's get some sidewalks fixed, let's get some things that are now sort of assumed that you're going to put trees on streets. There was no assumption like that. So that work program, I think, turned a significant corner. It was largely involved with and led by our neighborhood planning unit structure that Maynard put in place, and that sort of took a lull for a while when Andy was mayor and Maynard came back, and Bill Campbell were very responsive to the voice of neighborhoods and in that area of time. And then that extended to the duration of my time in the city, which ended in about 2005.
How did the city leaders at the time think about this balance between meeting local needs like sidewalks and trees and the global reputation of the city? I mean, and what the Olympics could mean in that regard in terms of attracting foreign investment and getting new migration here and positioning itself on the stage.
The approach that we took, and it was sort of coincidental, that just in that same moment, there was a strong back to the city movement, the idea of mixed-use development, walkable cities, trees, the beginnings of the ideas of bicycles and so on, which are assumed now and still crash on a regular basis, I might say. But that coincided with the will on the part of Maynard Jackson and Bill Campbell to actually respond to that market. And that led us to be able to interact with the development community, because it was the development community that was sensing. That's partly why it's a resurgence moment. We dropped from 500,000 to 400,000 people. We're going to use these Olympic moves to encourage and attract new investment. And we can't do that without a partnership between the development community and the city government. So I think that coincides. One point I think that is critical: if you want to get something done, there's nothing, and you got a pretty elitist one group, and you've got a city government, mostly black commissioners, black mayor, and so on the other. What can you do to bring them together to actually make things happen? Guess what? Deadline. There was no disagreement between ACOG and the city and CODA and the mayor that we were going to meet the deadline. So all of a sudden, a lot of the sort of assumed values from either side about the other weren't as important. I think that's really relevant for right now. Yeah. Like, my colleague and I have a website called Common Future ATL, which the idea is seeking a common future. I've been in this stuff for a long, long time. I've worked in a lot of places, and looking for the intersection, sort of forgetting about the either-or thing and talking about, okay, where is the nexus? Where's the both and? Where are the things that we can actually get something done? Mm-hmm. And I have an earlier life as a carpenter where I got something done every day, and I could see it, I could touch it, I could knock on it. So I've come from a position of getting it done. And understanding that if we do more good than harm as public servants, we probably done the best we can. These aren't triumphs and losses. These are, what can you do to take the next step, make things happen better? Yeah,
I want to come back to that and get your assessment of 25 years down the road. How are we doing in terms of some of the things that y'all started? But also, you mentioned this idea of elitism versus the current leadership, and I think the way Atlanta has said that it gets over that is this idea of the Atlanta way, that we look beyond race, and we the only color that matters is green, and we're too busy to hate and all that. How much of that is reality, and how much of it is marketing in your experience?
Oh, that's good long question. Let me start. So I got here in June of 1996. And my job included looking at all kind of other good ideas, one of which at that point in time was maybe we can make a access system to get people to the games. And Georgia Power put together an idea which really gradually morphed into what's now called the Beltline. But meeting, for example, about commuter rail to Athens, commuter rail to the south. So I would go to meetings in Gwinnett County. At that point in time, Gwinnett County was like 90% white. Its county commission was all white guys. And so we'd go to a meeting, Gwinnett, the cabs on Gwinnett. They said, well, if you're going to build a commuter rail from Atlanta to Athens, it ain't going to have a stop in Gwinnett County. So I realized, maybe we live in a city that's too busy to hate, but I'm sitting in a region that's got plenty of time.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because these things are a progression, right? Like, I mean, Gwinnett's voted recently for its, I think the third time or something on transit, voted it down, but it was a lot closer than it had, obviously, than it's been. And obviously that county itself is now majority minority, and
it's radically
amazing change. Yeah.
And it looks like Cobb is even radically changing.
Yeah.
And I've done studios with students in both Gwinnett and Cobb, Fulton, and so on.
Yeah. So how did you see, like, and this is something that shows up in our work a lot as we report on the city. How do you define the city of Atlanta, right? Like, I mean, there is the city, which is now back up to 500,000 residents or so. But then the metro area is what the world knows as Atlanta, 6 million people. Did you see challenges in getting things done, as you say, when you have a city that wants to do one thing in a metro area that has a lot of other competing priorities and jurisdictions?
Well, a couple things about that. And you did point out, and I think it's important for everybody to understand, that we dipped from 500,000 to 400,000 people. Now we're back up to 500,000 people again. The pivot point for that was the Olympics. And part of the pivot point was creating a kind of environment that the market was beginning to espouse. So we also have the Atlanta Regional Commission. Most of you are familiar with that. And it has had pretty good leadership consistently, and particularly in the last several years. Doug Hooker has been running that. Doug Hooker was a Public Works Commissioner, and we were cabinet members together in the Campbell administration. So I think some of the things that the ARC has done have been very complementary with the city's goals. And basically, one good example is, some of you may or may not be familiar with the Livable Cities Initiative that ARC, actually I was part of the process of answering the question. And these are all things that few of the people in the room are going to have any recall about. But the EPA came down hard on the region in 1998, said, you've got too much bad air quality, bad congestion. We're not going to give you any more money until you come up with a plan and start to implement a plan that actually deals with this spread sprawl phenomenon. Oh dear, why would that happen? It's probably spam risk. Do you all get calls from spam risk?
Hopefully it's not someone on the live stream calling to correct the fact.
Somebody help me figure out how to turn it off. There.
There you go. Livable Cities, ARC.
Yeah, so basically what we did, we figured out, okay, we got to sprawl. All of the stuff, I think, has a significant global, either implicit or specific. There are lots of others now who are courting global development in the region that weren't even thinking about it back then. Basically what we did is, okay, we're sprawling everywhere. We're building on green fields. We have nothing to organize that growth. And the result is increased vehicle miles traveled and air pollution spewed and so on and so forth. So why don't we simply say, we're going to concentrate growth and development where there already is growth and development, like towns, villages, and corridors, and we're going to discourage a development where we don't have those centers. And we're going to put our resources, both planning money and implementation money, into places like Hapeville or Roswell, or, we've got dozens of towns now that have taken advantage of building on that same market, which is, we want to live in a walkable mixed-use development. Not everybody wants to, not everybody should want to, but it's available, and it's available because of that, and that does two or three things. The density and interaction that creates some of the model, like Sewanee, or even we did a studio in Powder Springs, for example, and that market does exist. It is stable. It is growing slowly, but it is a place for reshaping growth for where we want growth to happen and discouraging where we don't. And we were able to model that. The ARC modeled that. The EPA was, and it's actually the whole Atlantic Station project was bound up in this whole dynamic. And we persuaded EPA and USDOT that we could restart releasing funds again. We had enough data. We had enough policy in place. We changed the zoning in a lot of these communities to prove to the federal overseers that, okay, we have a strategy for dealing with air quality. We have a strategy, and I think that helped a lot. It's not perfect.
Yeah. Where do you think we kind of missed the boat, or did we, on certain issues after the Olympics? Right, like opportunities to capitalize on the legacy where we may still be facing some challenges. I mean, I think some people argue that the city, in its rush to progress, is sometimes too accommodative of developers, for instance, and there's a lot of focus on affordable housing now, particularly around the Beltline. There's a lot of emphasis put on the fact that while Atlanta is booming, it's the most unequal city in the country in a lot of ways on income. So talk about areas where we still have a ways to go, and relate that back to the promise of the post-Olympic period, if you might.
That's one of the disappointments. We strengthen the neighborhood planning unit system. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically if you live in a neighborhood in Atlanta, your neighborhood is part of a neighborhood planning unit. It's one of the very few cities in the country, and another city that I worked in for a long time was Birmingham, also had a neighborhood structure where even if you were poor, minority, whatever, you lived in an environment where you were recognized in the government on a par basis with if you were rich and lived in Buckhead or whatever. And because usually the dynamics of neighborhoods all around the country is if you live in a rich neighborhood, you're going to get a lot of ends that you're not going to get if you live in a poor neighborhood. That's still true in Atlanta, but it's less true because there's a structure that recognizes the right and the responsibility of people living in whatever neighborhood to get active and step up. And that was Maynard's view here, and it was David Vann's and Richard Arrington's view in Birmingham. So I think one of the things that troubles me, and it's actually noted in the book, so we had about 20 to 25% of our population living in poverty, and whites, blacks, Hispanics. And that's not a good number. As you point out, we were the worst city in the country, and still are, in the Gini index, which measures the gap, and it's a wealth gap. It's really important to recognize the difference between an income gap and a wealth gap, because the way the structures and development and investment has gone on in the city and this nation has redounded to the benefit of the people who are already super rich. And so, that's so we have it. And in fact, one of the diagrams in the book is, okay, it charts both our population sequence, but also our poverty sequence. So we actually have more people living in poverty in the city than we did when we only had 400,000 people. And so what do you do about that? Well, the reality is, which is slipping away, not just in this city, but cities all around the country, little by little, the sort of so-called free market system of understanding decision-making at the public policy level has sort of regained an ascendance, which is that somehow, and you speak about zoning and affordable housing. Well, our problem with affordable housing, you will hear from all kind of people who are in the libertarian area or the super rich developers or REITs, real estate investment trusts, private equity. They will say the reason housing is expensive is because of regulation. Well, that's a big fat lie. The reason is because the people who build the housing have one metric that matters, which is their profit. So they say, well, we're going to build all this new supply. The reality in Atlanta about supply, we don't have a supply problem. We have an affordability problem. We've built 35,000 housing units in the last 10 years, and we've grown in population in the city by about 70,000, which comes out to be about one and a half people per unit. We have about 13,000 vacant housing units in the city of Atlanta. So we don't really have a supply problem. We have an affordability problem. And the way I sort of deal with this both in terms of transit and in housing, we sort of, if you think about the area median income, either by neighborhood or NPU or census tract or whatever, those above it I call choice people. They have choices. They might have problem paying for their house or whatever. They may have problem with their transportation, but they do have a choice. If you look below that and going progressively to 50% AMI or 30% AMI or poverty, those people don't have choices. They have need. And so I say both in transit planning, transportation planning, which I'm very involved in right now, you got choice riders, and the strategies and policies of MARTA and the city, and particularly the people in the North, was, well, we need to attract more, quote, choice riders. These are people who are usually white, and they're pretty well off, and they don't know how to get on a bus. That's not their preferred mode. So, we should be redirecting our transit dollars to where the needs are greatest. And we should be redirecting our policies with respect to housing affordability to people who need it the most. And the only way you can do that is to set up kind of a quid pro quo system. We've heard about that internationally, right, recently. if you want to develop this, and we did this during that follow-up of the Olympic, did it with Atlantic Station, great big development, right? Said, well, if you want our participation in this, if you want me to get the zoning to make it work, then you have to do this, this, and this. So we had work priorities set up as part of our development agreement. We had, and that was before affordability was such a big deal. Yeah. Still, we had a requirement that 20% of the units built in the residential part of Atlantic Station had to be affordable for people, 80%. Not good enough, but better than nothing.
Affordable is in the eye of the beholder sometimes, right?
I told him I give long answers to short questions.
Well, I want to cover as much ground as we can, and we got about 5 more minutes. So,
I thought we had all afternoon.
Well, you would have thought by the number of questions I sent you, but so I was hearing this morning, and we're looking forward to the 2026 World Cup.
Right.
It'll be 30 years on from the Olympics.
Yep.
What's your advice? What unfinished business could the World Cup help complete? How should we think about this from a city?
I am not too familiar with the structure of the group that's putting the World Cup together. But I would say that we should do two things. We should do one thing generally is when we see big investment possibilities coming to the city, who gains, who loses? Does it narrow that wealth gap or does it widen it? We have a lot of stuff that seems to be out there that could further exacerbate the wealth divide. So as an example, and that's what we were, the Jackson administration, the Campbell administration put that as a high priority. And that whole area, that's one another thing that's kind of interesting about this book and why, is that the sort of popular mythology about the Olympics sort of says, oh, it was all a private sector initiative. Well, about 1.7 billion was, but the other 1.3 billion was public, state, local, and so on. So I think going forward to the World Cup, I think it's great we get the World Cup. We really have a strong soccer population in the region, and I think that's all to the good. But when it comes time, in fact, this is one of the things that the big developments going on in the Gulch, that didn't have a very good quid pro quo in it. The city does have the authority, both in resources and also regulatory, to be able to say, if you want to, same thing happened in Microsoft and
I was going to ask you about that.
Say, if you want to build in Grove Park, then here's what you need to do. You need to provide housing as part of your development, and say basically, you want this, we want to, and that's what we did in Atlantic Station. You want this, and we want you to do it. We want to see Atlantic Station developed. On the other hand, if you do that, and you need our regulatory authority and so on, then and you accept that, then we should do it. There should be some kind of balance between private and public sector authority and resources. Right now, it's all getting scooped up.
So I'm going to ask one more thing, and then if y'all have questions, please let us know, and we'll accommodate those in the last few minutes. Who's doing it right? Is there anybody doing it right around the world? I mean, Atlanta's been looked at as an example for affordability and for the Olympics. Since then, it's been terrible.
Well, my son will tell you Costa Rica.
Okay.
But my sense of the reality worldwide is that we're moving into a greater and greater chaotic period, which opens the door for autocrats to come in and take charge. I think that's true across, the internet, whole development, internet, AI, and all that kind of. I'm beginning to see all kind of chilling stories about what AI is going to do. And we had students at Georgia Tech just this year doing a study where they assumed that AI would lie. So they posed the question, okay, how will AI respond when they're caught out in a lie? And for that far, so I don't know of a place that's really doing it either in the, I think, maybe California a little bit, but then they went crazy with their zoning changes and stuff like that.
So we all can learn from each other.
One of the depressing things about the world that we're living in, it kind of makes me glad I've lived this long, so I don't have that much longer to live, is that this march of autocracy, whether it's Hungary, whether it's Turkey, whether it's the U.S., whether it's India, whether it's China, basically denies where the real font of human creativity comes from, which is sort of what Hank Johnson was saying, comes from you. It's neighborhoods. Ideas get squashed. Even in the we gave away internet authority to the private sector back when Clinton's administration. And the effect of that is somebody has a good idea, they do something, they do it, and then it's either bought and squashed by a Microsoft or something, or it's incorporated and shifted to serve their primary goal, which is maximizing profit, which they're really good at.
Yeah, and some of them are now investing in Atlanta and potentially exacerbating some of the problems, or fixing them.
One last point is, I think what distinguished Atlanta among southern cities in this area, both globalization and also at least ventures and words that sounded good, like the Atlantic Way, basically it's money. And I had
realizing where the incentives lie, right?
Money.
Yeah.
And that obviously is what's oiling global trade, and it should. The point is that is a commonwealth that we should be distributing in a way that's fair to where our greatest social problems exist. Right. I came here, again, 1996, and a woman named Kathy Fox was the arts editor. And so we got to know each other somewhat. And she said, if you really want to understand Atlanta, think about this. If Atlanta could suck as hard as it can blow, we would be a coastal city.
Pretty good. Any quick questions? Because I think we're coming up on our time. So anybody got one? If not, no worries.
5 minutes to get upstairs.
All right, cool. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mike.